We also need this trade agreement to get approval, and it's big and it's complicated, and there's a lot of issues. And there are a lot of issues that sometimes as trade agreements get blamed for certain things. Trade agreements can have a big impact on parts of the economy, certainly in the manufacturing sector. But I think there's a lot more explanation that's going to have to go on. Certainly the NAM is committed with our companies and our business partners to have those discussions, but also to have frank discussions about some of the issues that we still want to see worked out in a positive way. I think overall, I think the election, it's certainly going to have an impact on this. And we've seen that in past trade agreements when they've happened. Many of you do remember quite clearly the Uruguay round trade agreements, which was not ultimately a highly controversial vote on Capitol Hill, went to hearings and markups September of that year, and it wasn't even a presidential election year, and was voted on after the lame duck. So we're just going to have to see. It's probably just too premature to talk about when that's going to happen.
Any other questions? I see. Yes, sorry, go ahead.
Adeline Hinder from the EU delegation to the US. I wanted to come back on the labor chapter. Tia, you've been expressing doubts about implementation. You haven't discussed so much the consistency plan and the new mechanism with the linkage to tariffs, the possibility to snap back areas, laying out obligations and a way forward. In other areas where a lot of changes are needed. So I'd like you to elaborate a bit more. Thanks.
Thank you, Evelyn. Yeah, the consistency plans are an interesting innovation. And what they do, for those of you who aren't following it very closely, is at least for 3 countries, for Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei, it lays out a very detailed plan for bringing labor laws and practices into compliance with the TPP provisions over the course of the next several years. There isn't a consistency plan for Mexico, which is definitely problematic, because that's one of the countries that we know we have significant labor problems. There's just been a couple of labor union leaders who have been imprisoned unfairly and are being treated very poorly. So I think it's interesting. We also have experience, for example, with the Colombia Labor Action Plan, which is not that different from the consistency plan, really. That was sort of an additional labor action plan that was put in place by President Obama in recognition that there were a lot of challenges for Colombia in coming into compliance with the labor provisions. And a couple of years after that labor action plan, we certainly hear from our Colombian brothers and sisters, our Colombian union counterparts, that they've been pretty disappointed in the implementation. But as you say, Adley, the consistency plans do tie the market access, particularly for Vietnam, to key benchmarks. What we had asked for instead, we wanted to see that if a country couldn't come into full compliance with the labor chapter of the TPP on day one, we thought that the benefits of TPP should be phased in as well. That was what we had asked for. For Vietnam, there is one big problem, which is that Vietnam has been given a 5-year grace period to come into full compliance with freedom of association, which is the bedrock labor right, the ability of workers to form unions of their own choosing, to form federations across sectors and nationally. And that piece has been explicitly waived for the first 5 years of the agreement. So we weren't happy to see that there was an exception for Vietnam in the consistency plan. Other than that, I think we have an open mind. We're going to watch those closely, and we appreciate the concrete details that were included in the consistency plan, but as I said, we still are a little bit jaded because of our experience with past plans like the Colombia Labor Action Plan.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, good morning. My name is Richard Baker, and I'm an independent business advisor and a former international executive for Ford Motor Company. My last assignment with Ford was in China, where I lived for 4 years. Big picture wise, and I'm going to direct this to Linda and Thea because you seem to have the different poles of the views on the agreement. China. We've read, we've heard that one of the reasons this is so critical to get it passed now is that if we don't, China's going to lead international trade as opposed to the United States. And I do believe that is a possibility. from the points of view of manufacturing and from the points of view of labor, what are the implications to us as it relates to China if this agreement is not passed?
Sure, thanks, Richard. I think we're already seeing it, is that chart. China has grown, we all know, as a manufacturer, while they have become, as they've risen people out, tens of millions of people out of poverty, they have become a great customer for manufacturers in the United States. Our exports have grown substantially to China, so too have manufactured imports into the United States. But also what we see, particularly in the Asia Pacific, but other parts of the world, and you probably well know this, is China has really been able to expand its reach. And it has done that with a lot more trade agreements than the United States has. Trade agreements that actually don't look like a US style free trade agreement, focus more on tariffs, not necessarily all tariffs, and not necessarily the core rules, the transparency, the anti-corruption, the standards on intellectual property and investment and some of the rest of it. And so I think if we can't move forward, if we can't figure out a way to move forward in the TPP, China's going to increase that. They've got trade agreements with many of these partners already. They're very active in negotiating as well. Every time these trade agreements happen, that exclude the United States, they exclude manufacturers that are manufacturing here in the United States. Our exports are disadvantaged because they're getting a special tariff benefit. It usually gets to zero, while our manufacturers are still paying that tariff. And we are not also getting at some of those non-tariff barriers, which I agree. It's very hard to quantify that. But when I was listening to Anku talk about the transparency and the anti-corruption, that's a big issue, trying to get product over borders when you have customs systems that aren't transparent, aren't streamlined, don't have set rules, and the prevalence of corruption is high. Now, we in the United States have very strong and enforced rules, our Foreign Corrupt Practices Act on that. That's not always true around the world, and so that puts manufacturers in the United States, our exports, and our workers at a competitive disadvantage. We've got a lot of work to do with China. There's no question about that. We've got some high-level, obviously, dialogues at the state-to-state level, the ongoing trade and economic discussions that our friends at USTR and Commerce have long run. But we've got a lot of barriers there, and I think one of the things that I look at when I look at the TPP is it gets at a lot of barriers that we've been that we've been discussing with China for a long time. Not always perfectly, but we've been trying to get China to agree to open its government procurement market, to make it transparent, and to provide reciprocal access. Well, Vietnam and Malaysia and Brunei have just done that in a very significant way, in a way that we haven't seen developing countries at their levels, at their sizes. I mean, we saw it, I guess, in CAFTA and a few of our smaller FTAs, but for countries of those sizes to move forward on that's something significant. The outcomes on intellectual property, and Lisa could talk about encryption. I mean, all of those types of things are really strong standards as we're looking forward to how we want to see trade move, because we think those are rules that protect us in the United States, that stop forced localization, including things in the investment chapter as well, that prohibit countries from inviting or incentivizing investment only if you come build here and export a certain percentage and hire so many workers or have your technology developed here. I mean, those are really strong provisions in the TPP that hopefully are going to stem some of the negative times. Sorry.
Thanks. I think it's important to unpack the talking point a little bit because you hear that all the time. If we don't do TPP, China will write the rules.